Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and this will be my Stamina Warden DPS guide. Stamden got a really nice buff for PvE in the Markarth DLC to the skill Subterranean Assault. This skill now auto-casts itself after it fires, opening up a lot more room in the rotation for other abilities. Previously, a Stamden rotation would be Sub-Assault, Skill, Skill, Sub-Assault, Skill, Skill, and so on. Now you're freed up to do Sub-Assault, Skill, 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 and then Sub-Assault again. Over the course of a fight, this gives you a lot more freedom to cast other abilities and still get the hard-hitting Sub-Assault to land. You'll see us utilize this in a few different ways to get some really good results. This small change really helped Stam Wardens to now compete with the other DPS classes. I'd really like to see some similar love go to Stamina Dragonite soon, as they are now the only Stam class lagging behind a bit in DPS potential. So I put together this video a little differently in the hopes that I can get across all the information, in fact even more information than I normally put in, but in a way that I can put it together a little quicker on my end and hopefully increase the number of builds that I can get out for each patch. So make sure to let me know in the comments below what you think about the new slightly altered format. Alright, so for this guide I'll be going over the basics of setting up your character, champion points, several gear options including a couple of AoE DPS setups and an option for those that haven't done trials yet, several skill bar setups, a few combat rotations, and finally we'll end with a few parses on the trial dummy where I show some of the setups I went over. And the last thing before we get started, make sure to give my Twitter page a follow if you haven't already. I keep it up to date with what I'm working on and when I'm doing my live streams on Twitch. Alright, let's get into it. First, we'll go through the basics of setting up our character. Here are the top races to pick from, the attribute points, our Mundus stone, our top food options, and the potions we'll be using. I highly encourage you to unlock as many passives as possible over the long run, but if you'd like a list of the absolute essential ones for this class, then I'll have it down in the description below. Now I'll go over the champion points. I'll show a couple of different options here. This first is for a fully optimized raid group. That means you'll have Major and Minor Breach, Infused Crusher, Alkosh, and Trimmer Scale going to fully debuff an enemy's physical resistance. Remember to adjust your CP accordingly for how much penetration you need. If you aren't reaching that 18,200 mark, you'll need to pull some out until you get there. I'd start with pulling some out from Thaumaturge, as most of our damage is direct damage in this setup. This next setup here is for practicing on the Iron Atronach trial dummy. For the dummy, you'll need 3212 penetration, as it does not have Trimmer Scale applied and uses the base 3010 value for Alkosh's penetration. Again, if you need more or less into piercing, adjust accordingly. And then finally, for the red and the green trees, these are just generic setups. You'll want to adjust these based on your personal preference as well as what content you're running. You can find these listed by class and trial at esou.com. Now we'll go over the gear options. One thing I really love about what ZOS has done with their arena set balancing is the variety of competitive options we now have available to run. Gone are the days where you feel forced to either run a Maelstrom bow on your back bar or lose out on a ton of damage. You can still do the Maelstrom bow, but the Master's bow, Black Rose Prison dual wield, and the Maelstrom two-hander all perform really well now, and you can really go with whatever playstyle you enjoy the most and get roughly the same damage numbers. The following will be the setups that I had the most success with, but as I mentioned, feel free to swap in and out for your preferred playstyles. The first setup is the one that squeaked out the highest damage for me while I was testing in my 111k parse. We are running a 5-piece Arms of Reliquin on the body. This has the strongest single target dot in the game, and a lot of people look at the tooltip and think it's just decent, but don't realize it actually takes once per second on its own, and also when you land a light attack, so really it's twice a second. Then we're using Berserking Warrior for the jewelry and for the battle axe on our front bar, and this set offers more crit chance than any other set in the game. Our back bar is the Black Rose Prison dual wield. This set adds a lot of tankiness and extra damage as well, with a 6% increase to both. 2 axes are the best option if you can. With 2 axes, we have about a 50-50 shot every time we go on our back bar of applying the dual wield bleed. If you can sustain bash weaving on your back bar as well, you can get this up to a 64% chance every time you go onto your back bar. For our monster set, if you are using the class spammable Cutting Dive and can sustain and are comfortable with bash weaving every 7 seconds, Marsalak is going to offer the highest DPS potential in a trial environment. This is due to the effect increasing in damage in larger parties with more negative effects on the enemy. If you aren't bash weaving or are using the two-handed ability Wrecking Blow as your spammable, Dome House seems to be the next best option. The ring won't hit on the dummy due to its radius, but just the weapon damage alone makes it a really good option. And it's a great option on fights where targets have large hitboxes, such as the dragons and Sunspire, as the ring will do damage and you'll get the weapon damage bonus. I'd say Selene is a very close third with Wrecking Blow, but if you're using Cutting Dive, Selene is going to fall pretty far down due to it only proccing from direct melee damage. For the armor weight, all medium on the gear is the best for damage and sustain, but you can use one heavy piece on your monster set if you'd like a little bit higher health pool to work with. For the traits, all Divines on the body, Bloodthirsty on the jewels, Precise on the front bar, and both axes Infused on the back bar. Infused is really close with Bloodthirsty on the jewelry, and I could see it being better for some encounters, so ideally you'll have a set of each to mix and match, but if you only have one set to work with, Bloodthirsty should be the most useful. For the enchants, all max stamina on the body. For your back bar, a weapon damage enchant, and then either a frost or poison enchant. Frost seems to be just slightly more damage than a poison enchant due to the Warden passive that gives extra crit damage to chilled enemies, but if someone else in your group is already running a frost enchant, a poison one should work better. Then for your front bar, double Ravage health poisons is the best option, but just a frost or poison enchant, whichever you didn't use on your back bar, works as well. You could also run an absorb stamina enchant here for a very slight sustain boost. The difference in damage in all the setups is pretty small. And then one last note, for fights where Reliquin doesn't seem to work too well, Leviathan or Yondir's Might seem to be your best alternatives. Leviathan provides a lot of extra crit chance, and Yondir a ton of weapon damage. You can also go with the same setup except have a bow on the back bar, so this is the setup I used with the Maelstrom bow to get my 110k parse. Another option is to go double dual wield. I found this to be about 1 to 2k DPS behind two-handed dual wield. You'll run an axe and dagger on the front bar with Nirnhoned and Precise for the traits. It doesn't matter if the axe or dagger are in your main hand, but make sure the Nirnhoned trait is in your main hand and the Precise in the offhand. Since you'll be proccing dual wield bleeds already on your front bar, I find that axe versus dagger versus dagger to be almost identical for your Black Rose prison weapons. The double axe is mostly important when you're running a different type of weapon on your front bar, and your back bar is the only opportunity to proc that bleed. And you'll notice I put Selene back into this setup. This is if you are using rapid strikes for your spammable. If not, it goes back to the order of Marsalak being the best with Doma House being second. And then finally, you can run this setup again with a bow on your back bar. And like I said before, you can also do the Maelstrom two-hand on your back bar as well for all of these setups. It's a little more awkward to use because your ground dot Stampede is a charge ability, but it provides roughly the same DPS amount. Alright, the next setup is for bow. I'm personally not a huge fan of the double bow playstyle, but I often get requests for it, so I wanted to include an option for it. Bow didn't have a great monster set to use before, so the Vatashran bow slides in perfectly as a front bar option. I found Leviathan and Reliquin to be the best combo here, but Zogvin and Yondirs are solid options as well. I'm not the most experienced at weaving bow abilities, but still managed a solid 102.8k parse with it. While a bit behind the other setups, I'm sure that it could be a little bit higher with some better weaving, and it's pretty solid for this hybrid ranged / melee option. It would go down a bit at full range, as you'd need to drop Barbed Trap for channel acceleration or run Zogvin over Leviathan, and your point blank snipe damage would come down some as well. But it's still a really good option if you prefer the ranged playstyle. For this next setup, with the introduction to the mythic Ring of the Pale Order, I thought I'd include a solo setup as well. I'll be using this ring and the Ring of the Wild Hunt all the time when I'm running around and doing solo stuff. For the monster helm, you can do any one-piece monster set that has weapon crit for more damage, or a one-piece armor of the trainee if you want a little more health. You can also do a shoulder here and just run a helm of this next set. For the other body pieces, aside from the chest, we are running Vicious Ophidian if you need the sustain help, since its 5-piece bonus gives a ton of cost reduction and stamina back for kills. Or we'll run Leviathan here if your sustain is fine for slightly more damage. Then for our second set, the Berserking Warrior chest, necklace, ring, and battle axe for fights that last a little longer, and then Briarheart in those spots for short burst fights. Briarheart does have a nice little heal as well, which could give you even more healing to go with your ring. Anything longer than about 11 seconds though, I'd stick with Berserking Warrior here. For your back bar, any of the options listed previously will work here, and all the traits and enchants are the same as before. Alright, this next setup I'll go over is for those that haven't done trials yet. There are a lot of sets that perform really close to each other, but I tried to put together a setup that would have gear that might still be useful later as well. For example, Leviathan will be a common gear set in trash setups or bow builds, and New Moon is popular across the board for both mag and stam, especially in PvP builds. So if you have the Leviathan jewels and don't want to craft or purchase the New Moon ones, that also works. Just do 3 body pieces of New Moon and it works out just the same. For the monster sets, the same ones are recommended here: Dome House, Selene, and Marcelok 2 if you are comfortable with bash weaving. For the back bar sets, all of the arena ones still work here as well, but I think Black Rose Dual Wield and the Maelstrom Bow are probably the easiest to get good results with. Remember, you can get these by running normal difficulty now, and the difference between the perfected versions is almost non-existent since they are on your back bar. If you haven't run those yet or haven't had luck with drops, you can just double bar New Moon or whatever other set you chose to run here. Some of the other non-trial alternatives that I thought were good DPS options are Pillar of Nirn, Briarheart, Hunding's Rage, Aegis Collar, Armor of Truth, and Zogvin's Warband. And all of the weights, traits, and enchants are the same as before. Another commonly requested type of gear setup that I haven't normally included in these guides are AoE, or as some refer to them, trash setups. These are a little harder to test as there aren't often groups running on the PTS, so I have to rely a bit on the information from others and a bit of mental math, but I hope to start including more in my builds. This first setup is using a 5-piece Deadwater's Guile. This is a great set for fights with a lot of enemies, as you can get your ultimate back up really fast and cast it much more often. This pairs perfectly with Balorg, as Balorg scales with your ultimate spent. Then we're running any 3-piece that has Minor Slayer and crit chance on it. Our front bar is a Master's 2-hander for the big brawler hits. The perfected is actually kind of nice on this one, as often you won't have every enemy debuffed all the way, so the extra little pin can come in handy. For our back bar, you can do either Maelstrom Bow, Maelstrom 2-hander, Black Rose Dual Wield, or Maelstrom Inferno Staff. I'll get into my reasoning behind the staff being an option later when I go through the skills. And then for this alternate second AoE setup, we focus more on just straight damage and not on building ult quickly. The arena weapons are the same, but for the gear we're running a 5-piece Leviathan and a 5-piece Yondir's Might. Yondir is cool because the bonus actually never goes away as long as it is active on both bars. So once it's built up, you have it set for as long as you need. Then you can time your heavy attack with your ultimate and get a ton of weapon damage while you spam your brawlers, or you can just hang on to the weapon damage too. It's good either way. Alright, that is it for the gear. I know that was a lot more than I usually go through, but I wanted to be a little thorough this time, so now we'll move on to the skills. As I mentioned earlier, if you're looking for the essential passives to take, I'll have a link to a chart in the description below. So for the first setup, we are using the setup that I used in my 111k parse with a 2-handed front bar and then Black Rose Dual Wield on the back bar. So our front bar will be Barbed Trap, Sub Assault, Growing Swarm, Wrecking Blow, Executioner, and then our ultimate is Wild Guardian. Then for the back bar, Bullnetch, Deadly Cloak, Rending Slashes, and then we have 2 flex spots here, so really whatever you need can go here. And then we do have to have the bear ult on both bars to keep it up. So why am I running Wrecking Blow over Cutting Dive? Cutting Dive does have the higher DPS potential if you want to focus your rotation around the off balance period. So every time off balance comes up, you stop what you're doing and you focus in on spamming that ability. So at least 6 times you want to use your Cliff Racer whenever the off balance period comes up. I personally prefer an easier and more static style of rotation. So if you also prefer that, then Wrecking Blow does seem to do a little more damage than Cliff Racer. But if you want to go all out and focus around that off balance period, then Cutting Dive could get you a little bit higher results. I won't be going over that type of rotation in this video. If you want a good example of that, make sure to check out Revel X. He got some really great results with it. It is a little bit harder to keep up, and like I mentioned, I prefer the more static style, but I'll drop a link to his parse video in the description below if you want to check that out. So just a few more things to note about this setup. If you are using dual wield on your front bar, then you can replace Executioner with Whirling Blades, and then Wrecking Blow with either Rapid Strikes or Cutting Dive. And then if you're using a different back bar, you can replace Deadly Cloak with the appropriate back bar dot skill that your weapon has. And then you can also replace Rending Slashes with Consuming Trap or a Flex Spot here if you're not using dual wield on your back bar, or you need some more sustain help. So this is the bar setup I used in the two-hand and Bow Parse, and like I said, it's pretty much the same. I just have Endless Hail there on the back bar instead of Deadly Cloak, and then we have a few flex spots. If you are running the Master's Bow here, you'll want to replace one of those flex spots on your back bar with Poison Injection. And you could also run Soul Trap on one of these spots for an extra dot as well if you wanted to keep that up. This third setup is the one I used with the Vatashran bow for the 102k parse. It's pretty much the same again. I did drop Growing Swarm because with the Vatashran bow, one cast of Lethal Arrow is worth more than you'll get from the whole duration of Growing Swarm. If for some reason you're the only warden in the group and they need that debuff from you, then go ahead and still cast it. I didn't slot Acid Spray when I was parsing because it's just a single target fight, but for more AoE fights, it's a great skill to slot, and then you'll see the back bar is pretty much the same too. We just have a couple of flex spots there. If you don't want to use a bow on your back bar, you can replace Endless Hail with the appropriate skill there as well. And then you can also swap Trap for Channeled Acceleration if you can't get into melee, or drop Trap completely if you're running Zogvin. And then finally, I'll go over the AoE skill setup. We're running Bullnetch, Sub Assault, Bird of Prey for the passive, Brawler, Executioner, or Reverse Slice depending on the trial, and then Flawless Dawnbreaker for our ultimate. For our back bar, we're running Elude for the major evasion. If you're running a Black Rose Prison dual wield, you don't need this skill here. You can just have a flex spot there since Deadly Cloak gives you that same buff. But if you're running any other back bar, it's a pretty nice one to have, especially since a lot of times in trash, you are going to be subject to a lot of outgoing damage. So having that major evasion up is pretty nice. And then our second skill here will be our back bar dot, depending on what kind of weapon we have. So Deadly Cloak with dual wield, Endless Hail with the bow, or Arrow Barrage, and then Blockade of Fire if we're using a staff, or Stampede if we're using a two-hander. Then we have Bird of Prey double barred here, just so we always have our Berserk up. And then flex spot here, you can run Resolving Vigor if you need a heal. And then our fifth slot is Channeled Acceleration for our minor force buff. Then our ultimate on the back bar will be either Flawless Dawnbreaker or Fiery Rage if you're running a staff back bar. So this is kind of the only reason we would possibly run a staff back bar. So this update actually brought a little bit of a change to weapons. So your light attacks and heavy attacks will now scale with your weapon damage or your spell damage for whatever type of weapon you're using. And then this isn't new, but our ultimate also scales with either one of those. So the Destro ult, Fiery Rage, will scale with your stamina and your weapon damage. So you might be wondering about your spell penetration here, since you normally wouldn't have enough, but that's one of the reasons we use Baylorg and the AoE setup we mentioned earlier, is because it gives us a ton of spell pen as well. So we'll actually be over the cap on spell pen even on a stamina setup. I think this could situationally be pretty good, because even though your wall won't do a lot of damage, it will buff your light attacks, which get splash damage with your two-hander, and then also the Destro ult is going to hit like a truck. I think this could outweigh the damage from something like the Maelstrom bow and Flawless Dawnbreaker's damage put together, but it's probably pretty close either way. I think it's a pretty fun setup to try out though. So I'll briefly go over a proposed rotation with this AoE setup, since I didn't include a full diagram in the rotations that are coming up. You'll pre-buff your Channeled Acceleration, Bullnetch, and Sub Assault, and then you'll drop your Destro ult if you're doing a staff, followed by your Blockade, and then you'll just spam Brawlers. For a longer encounter, you'll reactivate Sub Assault, but for a shorter one, you'll just spam Brawler till they die. For a more traditional back bar setup with bow or dual wield, I'd pre-buff Channeled Acceleration, Bullnetch, and Sub Assault, and then activate your back bar dot, so Endless Hail, Deadly Cloak, or Stampede, and then drop your Dawnbreaker, followed by Brawler spams. Like I said, a lot of this is theory since it is hard to get a group on PTS, but it seems like this would be a pretty solid setup for AoE. Now I'll go through all the single target rotations. As I mentioned earlier, check out RevelX's video if you want something fully dynamic that revolves around fully utilizing the Cliff Racer spammable during the off balance period. These I will present will be ranging from intermediate to easy difficulty. This first setup here will be the two-hand and dual-wield rotation, and it's using the first set of gear I showed and the first skill bar set that I showed as well. This is the one that got the 111.7k DPS. So we pre-buff our Bullnetch and then cast Sub Assault and our Trap, And then we open our rotation with light attack weaving on Deadly Cloak and Rending Slashes, and then bar swap, and then Growing Swarm in our ultimate. And then we do one of our spammables, in this case Wrecking Blow, and then another Sub Assault, and then 3 spammables. And then the repeating rotation after that will be Sub Assault, bar swap, Deadly Cloak, Rending Slashes, bar swap, Growing Swarm, 2 spammables, Sub Assault, 3 spammables, and then we'll start over. You'll replace one of these spammables with either your Barbed Trap, your ultimate, or if you need some sustain help, you can cast your Bull Netch again here in one of these spots as well. But really the only 2 things you need to keep up with are your Barbed Trap and your ultimate. You'll notice when we start our rotation over, we are casting our Sub Assault a bit early. So the reason we're doing that is that we'll always end our front bar with Sub Assault instead of a Wrecking Blow. Because with Wrecking Blow being a cast time ability, it's really hard to get the timing down to swap off of it onto your back bar without losing time on your parse. So this just ensures we'll always end up on that Sub Assault before we bar swap. And this also helps the rotation to be static. So if we cast Sub Assault every 6 skills instead of casting a little early here, we'll end up with a more dynamic rotation, since that's not going to line up with Deadly Cloak and Rending Slashes being on a 10-second timer. You can do this though if you want to, and if you're comfortable doing a more dynamic rotation, and you can squeeze out a little more DPS this way. So you'll just have to keep track of your Sub Assault and do Sub Assault 5 skills, Sub Assault 5 skills every time, and keep track of it that way. I thought this was just a little easier. It's easier to bar swap off of, and it's really only a small DPS loss to cast it early there, so just worked out a little better for me personally. For Execute, we're going to drop Wrecking Blow for Executioner at 30%. Then we'll drop our Growing Swarm at 28%. And then we'll drop Rending Slashes about 10%. Rending Slashes is kind of a tricky one here, so Executioner actually passes it up for damage at about 20%, but if you proc your Twin Blade and Blunt Bleed also with that Rending Slashes, that outperforms Executioner all the way through the fight. So if you get those both to proc together, and it has a really decent chance of proccing Twin Blade and Blunt. It's about a 50-50 shot or so every time you're on your back bar. So I kind of split the difference here with when to drop it. So after about 10%, it's probably not worth the risk because of how much your Executioner is doing, but it's kind of up to you if you want to risk it for possibly getting a little more damage, or if you just want to play it a little more safe with more consistent damage. So for Execute, I am going a little more dynamic with it since we have a little less to keep up and worry about. I'm casting my Sub Assault every 6th skill, so I try to kind of count it in my head like shulks 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, shulks 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 as I'm doing my skills so I can keep up with it. Then you'll just cast your Deadly Cloak and Rending every 10 seconds until it's time to drop Rending, and then cast your Executioner and your Bear Ult as often as possible. If you can, don't cast your Bear Ult in between like 30 and 25% health, because your Executioner actually passes up your Bear Ult for damage during that little brief window, and then your Bear Ult doubles in damage after that. So try to hold it for right when you start that Execute. And then we'll just keep up our Barbed Trap for minor force as needed. If there's just a few seconds left in the parse and it's going to run out, don't worry about it. Just keep spamming your Executioner. And one last thing to mention, if you are using your Cutting Dive ability here instead of Wrecking Blow, you will drop your abilities at a little bit different points. So you'll drop Cutting Dive about 38% for Executioner, and that's if there is no off balance period. If you are in an off balance period, then you'll still cast your Cutting Dive up until about 20%, and then you drop it all together and just use Executioners in its place the rest of the way through. So this next setup is pretty much the same. This is just for the dual wield plus dual wield. So the rotation is pretty much identical. We just have rapid strikes here in place of Wrecking Blow, or Cutting Dive if you're using your class spammable. So as I mentioned, the rotation's the same, except we'll drop rapid strikes for Whirling Blades at about 20%. This is because Whirling Blades is a bit weaker of an execute than Executioner is, and rapid strikes is a bit stronger of a spammable than Wrecking Blow is. So Whirling actually doesn't pass up rapid strikes till just after that 20% mark. And then we'll drop Growing Swarm at 25%. And then Rending Slashes, it really doesn't get passed up by Whirling until about like 6% or so health left. So as long as you're going to get the full duration from it, it's probably worth it to cast it. If not, then don't recast it. And if you're running Cutting Dive with this setup, you'll want to start replacing it with Whirling Blades as soon as you can to sustain throughout the rest of the parse after about 40%. It's a really expensive skill, so you might have to wait a little bit longer to actually get through the parse without running out of stamina, but after about 40% is when it passes it up for damage. And again, that's if there's no off-balance period going. If there is an off-balance period going, you want to keep casting Cutting Dive almost till the end, until the last like 5 or 6%, and then just let Whirling Blades take it out from there. Alright, so for this rotation, it is again using the two-hand and dual wield, and it's the same gear setup as the first setup shown and the same skills as the first setup shown as well. The main difference is we just have a longer spammable period, as we're not recasting our sub-assault in that period, and we're just spamming our spammables. So it's not quite as much damage, but if you'll see, I was just behind my top parse. This one I got 110.9k DPS, and it's a much easier rotation. The main reason it's so much easier is you have this long window to keep up with your trap or your ultimate, like 6 spammables in a row, and so as long as you can keep up with them enough to recast them during that period, everything else about the rotation is static. So I listed the rotation for execute here this way. You can keep it the same way as your actual rotation. You could also, if you're comfortable enough with it, do the rotation from the last one shown in execute as well, and just cast your sub-assault every 6 abilities. And then again, I just wanted to show here that the same rotation can be done with double dual wield. And this last rotation here will be for two-hand and bow. It'll be a little different since we're using Endless Hail, which is on a 14-second timer, instead of Deadly Cloak, which is on a 10-second timer. So if you're using Arrow Barrage, which is on the 10-second timer for maybe for the Master's Bow, you can just swap that into the other rotation and do that one. This is more for if you're using the 14-second timer. So we'll open up with our Bull Netch, Sub-Assault, Endless Hail, and Trap, and then we'll start our light attack weaving with Growing Swarm, our ultimate, Wrecking Blow, Sub-Assault, and then 7 Wrecking Blows. And then the remaining rotation will just be Sub-Assault, and key difference here, before we bar swap into Endless Hail, you want to light attack on that front bar, and then bar swap and cast Endless Hail. It's a lot smoother and a lot quicker than if you cast your Sub-Assault and then bar swap and try to light attack into Endless Hail. There's a little delay there with how fast you can cast the ability. So the fastest way to do it is to light attack, sub-assault, light attack, bar swap, Endless Hail. And then you'll bar swap and do 5 Wrecking Blows, sub-assault, and then 5 more Wrecking Blows. And you'll start that rotation over. Again, just like the other rotations, you can swap in Rapid Strikes if you're using a dual wield on the front bar, or you can swap in Cutting Dive for either two-hand or dual wield. The execute percentages where we drop abilities for two-hand and dual wield are both the same as the other rotations. And for the rotation for execute, it's going to be just the same as pre-execute. We'll just have executioner in place of whatever spammable you were using. And I forgot to mention earlier, with Growing Swarm, we are keeping it up dynamically in place of one of our spammables each time we're going through our rotation. So if you don't want to do that, if that's a little too much for you, you can just cast it once after Endless Hail, and then it will fall off for a few seconds, but it's better than not casting it at all. And then the final note on this rotation, it's the same one I used for the bow setup. You just replace Wrecking Blow and cast Snipe in its place. With the bow setup, I was using the Maelstrom bow and not the Master's bow, so even though I had Poison Injection on, I didn't start casting it until execute because it's not really worth running as a dot until about 25 or 30% health left, unless you are running that Master's bow. Alright, that's going to be the end of this guide. It was a little longer than usual, but hopefully the extra info is helpful for some people. I did want to note before ending this that I think the Vodashran dual wield could be a really interesting option for some fights too. Unfortunately, it's bugged on the PTS and doesn't return stam like it's supposed to, so I haven't been able to properly test it since I can't actually sustain it in a parse. If this does end up being a thing, you'll just drop your monster set for it, run 2 heavy Berserking Warrior pieces, and run Shrouded Daggers in place of your execute ability. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'll let the video play out with a few of the rotations that I managed to record. The 111k two-hand and dual wield parse using the first rotation, the 110k two-hand and dual wield parse using the easier second rotation, and then the 110k parse using the two-hand and bow rotation. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.
this time. I'm hoping it was here, wishing it was there, working it out, working it out. See, we're falling, I'm still holding you. Yes, you. See, we're falling, I still hold on to my roots. So don't to me, don't to me, don't to me like you do, like you do. Don't to me, don't to me, don't like you do, like you do, like you do, like you do. I won't break when it's heavy. I'll stay near if you let me, but I won't make a remake of passion. I won't stand for less than a classic. Now here we are, we see like we wanted to see. I'm getting there with you, you were rolling with me. I'm feeling no decree, waving like the sea, loving everything about you. So don't to me, don't to me, don't to me like you do, like you do. Don't to me, don't to me, don't like you do, like you do, like you do, like you do. I won't break when it's heavy. I'll stay near if you let me, but I won't make a remake of passion. I won't stand for less than a classic. I won't break when it's heavy. I'll stay near if you let me, but I won't make a remake of passion. I won't stand for less than a classic. That's not me, 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 that's Open your mind, I feel the love grow, I feel the love grow. Open your mind, open up your mind. I feel the love grow, I feel the love grow. Open your mind, hold up your mind. I feel the love grow, I see the love go up.